I'm going to stop broadcasting for a minute and then restart. So if I'm here, how's that sound? So if he steps in front, or if he walks here, or he walks back, you're hearing, well, there are people hearing me, but can you hear me above all that? I mean, obviously people Okay, what if I hang right here? How's that? Is that any better?
There was like a whole lot of radio. So people, so and I didn't ever been
Well, I mean, that's because a lot of people are talking and, people obviously will be quiet. Okay, because there's a lot of people in the other room having coffee and chit-chatting and stuff. And I don't know if I can silence that. I think my but I was worried about that when I saw it go flying. Let me try, there's a couple settings here. Let me try this just a second. I'm going to go back to the other mic. Because that is really optimal. Okay. Can you hear that any better, Claudia? All right, so now I'm testing the mic. Oh, good. Is it coming through the speakers? Oh, good. It was just a matter of a setting. The little button must have gone. Let me try this setting. Can you hang on just a second? Okay, starting. Is that any better? Does that sound better? Okay, so whether you're closing your eyes to a situation you did not wish to acknowledge, that's good? Or you're not aware of the caliber of disaster? Okay, let me try this one again. You are not aware of the caliber of disaster indicated by the presence of a pool table in your community. Well, you got trouble, my friends. Oh, yes, got trouble right here in River City. How's that? Sure, I'm a billiard player. Always might have tried to say it. Okay, well, I'm kind of holding it, walking around. Let me put it where it's going to be. All right, yeah, no, I think a switch had just gotten switched. Okay. So this will be pretty consistently where he'll be. Oh, good. Oh, that's a relief. Yay! Okay. How's the freeze factor? Is it freezing up? Okay, excellent. Okay, let me test sort of I want to give him some more parameters as to where he can go. So let me walk over here. So, in terms of what's coming over the speakers. What if I'm over here? Can you hear me at all? Okay, can you hear me over here? Okay, so we need to ask him to stay sort of right in this range. And otherwise, you're not going to be able to see much of him anyway, so. Okay. So he can maybe just be on this side of the podium, but not go far afield. Okay. Probably not as well, because I don't have it pointing. How's this? Okay, so he really needs to stay sort of in this range. Okay, all right. Okay, well, great.
This won't last very long. Hopefully this one will.
Well, she wants me to,
You want to stand there and
when she's ready to say something.
so
When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. Does that work? Good. You're welcome.
Testing, test. Oh, yes. Good.
We won't need the. Oh, that's.
That's the mic for the webcam.
So, and this is the mic for here.
Yeah,
So
this is that's
I've got
actually
to actually stay near
pretty
this.
close. Yeah, if you could just sort of stay. So you tested it out to about here, and they had trouble hearing you there. That's actually
So I
a pretty good mic.
this is the place.
That's
so.
your zone.
I think it's a bit tall for me to be right behind you.
But
as
this
long
will
as-
pick you up fine. We tested it kind of here
Okay.
up to maybe here. So if you could just stay in this little zone.
Stay on this side. Okay, that's got that organised.
Additional batteries
Okay, for
for that thing,
the
yeah.
if it begins to fade. So, okay.
Yes, yes, yes. It's exact. That's a good idea.
Because of the webcam, it's futile to have this over here. Somehow I have to put it into It's best.
We're not going to begin quite yet. The last couple times we've done something like this, people come at 9:15, so, and all of you have been fabulous coming tonight. We do have two, actually we have one web hub. I wish they couldn't tried so hard to connect to Maine, just couldn't get their connection going. I had a guy out there yesterday. But anyway, there's another connection up in Blue Hill, and they're not ready yet because so they're getting their teas and coffee. So we need to wait for them so they can join us. And I will tell you that this will be on the Episcopal Diocese website. So that if you want to go back over and listen to it, watch it, you can access that. And anyway, so keep talking. We're going to wander around today. And I'll tell you, there are bathrooms in the hall, and insurance does not want you on the slides out there, so. But certainly introduce yourself. Sorry.
Good morning. Welcome to St. Nick's. My name is Carl Bradenberg. Cynthia and I are co-wardens here at St. Nick's. Our priest, David Heald, is a good friend of Martin Smith, but is down in Washington, D.C. for his older daughter's graduation from college. So he sends his regrets, both to you, Martin, personally, and to everyone else. So I'm just sort of sitting here. We're delighted that you're here. A welcome also to the people at Blue Hill who are, we're getting a live stream from that amazingly small video.
They can't hear you, Carl.
They can't hear me. That's different.
Here's the mic.
And a welcome to the people then at Blue Hill who are getting the live feed of this. I'm also told that well, you heard that it's going to be available on the website. Three things. The restrooms, I think you know, are around the hallway there to the left. There is out in back a prayer garden if somebody wants to go out during a break or something like that and have a moment's quietness out in the corner of the yard there. If you see a lot of kids stuff around, that's because this is also the home of Sandpiper Preschool and Daycare Center, which is operated by St. Nick's. So that there's a lot of their equipment still around. But a warm welcome to everybody. We're delighted to have you here, and I think you're going to take it from.
Thank you. Thank you especially to Carl, who's the electronic person, Linda, who works in the office, who was wonderful a couple of times, showed us around and was very welcoming, and David, and to all of those who might be here from St. Nicholas. Thank you for Claudia Smith up in Blue Hill, who's managing all of that, and Ginny Urbanik, who tried very hard up in Aroostook and Holton, and also want to thank especially Heidi Schott from the diocese, who is doing the whole web streaming, web hubs, web everything. It's wonderful. And Vicki Black, who put together a beautiful poster for us and a lot of the undercurrents for this conference. I also want to thank all of you for coming. This is not an easy topic. This is not an easy journey, as most of you know. And some of you are here because you work in the caregiving business, and I hate to call it a business because it's such a heart thing. A lot of you are here because you are walking the journey, and you're here because things are slipping out of your mind, or your mind isn't working quite the way it used to, or you're here because your dear loved one is experiencing either dementia, Alzheimer's, memory loss. You know the confusions, you know the hardness, you know the sorrow, the extreme pain, the future that's so unknown, and never mind the cost of it all. And you're here. That takes a lot of courage, and a lot of bravery. Thank you. And thank you for all those who may be listening later on who wanted to be here, but this topic is so raw that they could not gather in a community. And so I just want to recognize all of you who are out there who may be listening in the privacy of your room later on. I want to open with a poem written by a caregiver. On the border, on the brink, we shiver like quivering tears, swollen to fullness with distress, reluctant to spill in excess, strapped in delusions wondrous and weird. We ride roller coasters of reality through joy and fear. On the brim, on the rim, like balls circling in frustration, we scramble for thoughts lost in nets of uncertainty. Invaded by memories, peeping, creeping, weeping, we laugh and cry to the rhythm of nostalgia. On the fringe, on the edge, changing, adjusting, impacting, we crave compassion in our search for society's sanctuary. Let us pray. O gentle God, we have gathered to open our hearts in some of the most fragile places in our hearts today as we listen to Martin and as we listen to each other. There is great wisdom here, O God, within each of us. May we have the courage to share it. May we have courage to listen deeply to each other in great trust. And may you, O God, listen deeply, not just to our words, but to those silent places in our hearts where we cannot find the words for them. Bless us, O God. And may we take from here such blessings as to bring to our loved ones, to our society. And may we also work to make those places in our society a sanctuary for love. Amen. Martin, Marianne's going to introduce you, but we're so thrilled you're here.
Well known throughout the church and beyond. Martin visited us and spoke 2 years ago, and some of you may have been there. You know, if you were, that this is something that really is unequal in terms of the presentation and how he handles himself and how he handles our questions. If this is your first experience listening, I know that you'll take a lot away and be very happy that you were part of it today. And I welcome you, and I'm delighted to
Thank you. This is my zone that I have to stay within. And greetings, everyone out there. I'm glad you're participating through the web outreach we have. Just to let you know, my own style is not to use set pieces or pre-written lectures. There's nothing in print. So we are going to be on a leading edge of conversation. I have a lot up here. It will come out in due course, but we don't have everything chopped up into pre-packaged portions. And we can afford to take short stretch breaks so that we're not rooted to the spot for hours on end. I've just been recently diagnosed with an exotic knee disorder called pseudo-gout. So I appreciate the need to move around occasionally. Is that okay? So launching right into this, let me just tell you a little about my own stake in this. About 20 years ago, a researcher in the field, I didn't know he was in the field of Alzheimer's, came to me and said, "Marty, can I take you out for lunch? I want you to leave your brain for medical research. I was very flattered, thinking, my goodness, I'm being recognized for this extraordinary instrument I have up here. And then he explained, would I participate in Alzheimer's research? And for a number of years, I was a volunteer in the development of an early onset test related to the fact that the part of the brain that governs the speed with which a dilated pupil returns to normal apparently is affected early by people who are going to develop Alzheimer's later on. So I was glad to be a participant over several years in this research project. Apart from that, I have no particular expertise. So I've come here with the sense, simply, we all need all the help we can get to face a crisis of this magnitude. Because the recent extension of our life expectancy is so remarkable and unprecedented that it's now known that if you reach the age of 85, you then have a 50% chance of dementia in the years that follow. Never in human history have there been so many people who've been preserved from death for so long that they run the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's to this extent. Remember, in Jesus' time, only 1 in 21 people lived over the age of 60. Elders were few and far between. And now we just heard on the radio yesterday that by 2050, a third of China's population will be over 60. I mean, these are unprecedented human changes. We all need all the help we can get at the increased odds we have of a loved one, of ourselves, facing dementia as part of the end chapters of our life story. And you're already probably people who are gaining help from the medical profession, from demographers, and from life expectancy people, and you get help about insurance, you get help about the practicalities of caregiving, respite, all those things. We need all that help. We need help from the counseling and psychological community. And you could have had a string of people coming today to give all those practical forms of help. Now, I'm not in that category of help giver. And the only help I can provide is by creating a forum, a running conversation that we can have, to ask questions about the resources we need for making meaning of this experience that we're facing, the experience of being intimately related to or connected with people with dementia, or the experience of its onset for ourselves. And let's launch then right into a profound reason why dementia is such a profoundly frightening and threatening phenomenon. We're calling this a workshop, aren't we? It's a perfectly conventional phrase, a workshop. But that's quite a useful phrase because human beings are makers intrinsically. It's part of the intrinsic definition of a human being, is that they make things. And a marvelous psychologist called Keegan says, organisms organize. And what the human organism organizes is meaning. What makes a human being distinctively human is that we organize meaning. As we make meaning of our lives, of our environment, of our story, of our relationships. What is so remarkable about the human person and persons in community is that we depend on an ongoing imaginative process of making meaning of our environment. Just think about the circumstances in which this phrase making meaning or making something of things crops up. You might go to an art gallery with a friend and you come across some very startling and strange artwork. What do? You call your friend over and say, "What do you make of this?" In other words, it's perfectly normal. Or our daughter sends us a strange poem in a letter, and we can't make head or tail of it. So we say, "Darling, what on do you make of this?" You know, like we can't figure it out. We want help to make meaning of something. So, although this is a very philosophical way to begin our day, I don't think it's anything other than actually a core issue for us all. Because most people make meaning by the continual editing of a story. Human beings are narrators of meaning. Most of us aren't philosophers, so we don't write philosophical analysis about it. We tell the story of our life. A lot of that, of course, is rather fictional, because we continue to massage, to edit, to censor, to shape our narratives. But we keep on telling it, we peg the stories along the line. What we omit and what we add is up to our own sort of existential courage. Some people tell very banal stories. Others can tell more intimate, more emotionally honest, richer stories about the unfolding of their life. And we know that to be a human being then is to pass through various crises of meaning making. The famous 40s crisis, you know, that we're very aware of. And then there's another crisis, isn't there, that comes on with retirement. I'm retiring in, is it 65 days? And, you know, I'm waking up in a cold sweat thinking, you know, because I've really sort of worked hard all my life, and I'm just steeling myself. I hope I don't get a nervous breakdown right away, you know. But I know there'll be some kind of breakdown, because my whole body is geared to 9 o'clock palpitations, you know, get to the office, get cracking, get working, get going. So it'll be a crisis. It's a crisis in my own narrative. What happens then when we see before our very eyes a human being losing the capacity to tell the story of their own lives, or to participate any further in the conscious narrative of a life? Is it any wonder that it strikes us to the very core of our being with distress and affliction, because we are seeing something ceasing before our very eyes to be able to do something which in our heart of hearts we know to be intrinsic to the human nature, the human character? Could there be anything? I mean, physical illness, other crises, even mental illnesses for which recovery is a reasonable prospect, those are bad enough. But when we see and experience in relationship the irrevocable deterioration of those parts of the brain which function in the ongoing meaning-making story of being a human being. And we know that that's what the brain does. So when it ceases to be able to do that, we know there's a very unlikely to be able to any return. Of course, we hold out great hopes for prevention and for slowing down dementia. Medical science will do great things, but still, we are faced with the prospect of that irrevocable loss. So we shouldn't be surprised then that this is such a field for denial avoidance, terror, numbness, panic, depression, sorrow. These are all entirely proper and legitimate reactions to something which is so at the heart of what we understand a human being to be and to do. I find that's quite helpful right away to acknowledge that. So paradoxically, the kind of conversation we might be having today, might have in other contexts, is how do we make meaning out of loss of meaning? This is a very paradoxical thing we've been called to do today, is how do we make meaning of the prospect that our loved ones have or are losing their ability to make meaning for themselves? How do we make meaning of the prospect that we, in the next few years, may experience those early stages of our disorganization in organizing meaning? When you start to be unable yourself to organize meaning, or start to recall or remember, you know that a process has started which really cuts to the very heart of your own identity as a person who can tell a story based on our ability to marshal memories into a meaningful pattern, into a story. Does this all make sense? I don't say that this particular approach is all that current, or that we use this language in our liturgy or in our preaching enough. I would be tremendously helped if people could pray aloud, in which we recognize that for those of us who have religious faith, one of the most meaningful ways of imagining our life of faith is that God is profoundly on my side in the journey of meaning making. That God is that intimate presence who asks of me and whom I can ask, what shall we make of this? And so I think in the coming hours we can perhaps begin to that challenge, which is, are there various ways in which an unflinching recognition of the crisis that dementia brings to our meaning making might in some sense be this is a critical opportunity for us to say, I need to really reimagine my relationship with God so that I am not alone or isolated in this terribly difficult task of making meaning of my own loss of function or being in relationship with someone who is severely dysfunctional in memory. So this is the spirituality. I mean, the idea that we have a spirituality preparedness for dementia is a little far-fetched in a way. What we're saying is this particular crisis might say, I can't go forward any further in making meaning of this aspect of my life using my old concepts or my old picture of how God is with us. It won't work. It doesn't help. What I might need is a spiritual reframing of God's presence in our lives so that I experience a profound and tender companionship of God in the very difficult challenge of making meaning of this dimension or this phenomenon in my life. So do you think I think that's what spirituality is. That seemed to ring a bell? And in some paradoxical way, as with so many crises, God is at hand to arouse potentially new and life-giving ways of relating to God. That God uses crises to arouse us to a more authentic, emotionally honest and real appreciation of God's presence and God's grace. We might just say, for this challenge, conventional and shallow notions about God have got to give way to something much more serious, something even more tragic, more profound. And when we come to this word profound, we've come across a word that I think is very helpful when we think of spirituality. I can't read most spiritual books because kind of packaged spirituality, I don't know, it gives me the creeps in a way. But I don't go, it's like reading self-help books. People have got all the answers. But I always find that spirituality helps me when it really is an ability to help you live with questions, which by definition there are no easy answers. Our Archbishop Rowan Williams says, God is the one who enables us to ask the unanswerable questions. I think, oh, that's what I call spirituality. So, here we are. And the first thing I'm going to do today is, there is enormous potential in very deep doctrines about the human person in Christianity, which if we tapped into their depths, would have an extraordinary effect on our ability to lean into the crisis caused by dementia. Let me explain. I have found in 40 years of ministry, very few people who have a living or dynamic faith in the resurrection, in what the Creed calls, I believe in the resurrection of the body, in the life to come. I find it's much more normal for people to say, oh, my Christianity is very much a this life thing. If I wanted to do all that stuff about heaven, I'd go to a fundamentalist church. I like a this life religion. If there's life after death, fine, who knows? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. If there is, well and good. If not, who cares? That kind of thing. I mean, this agnosticism is very common in the Episcopal Church, and we often make a virtue of our hospitality to people whose faith is a little lite when it comes to doctrine, you know. Come as you are and stay as you are. It's often the motto of a liberal Episcopal church is, you know, we won't disturb you by challenging you about the creed, you know, keep your fingers crossed behind your back like the rest of us. So we go to funerals and we pay lip service to life after death sort of language from the priest. We're taking it with a pinch of salt. You know, we stand up and say, I'm sure Auntie is looking down on us now, if only she'd lived long enough for Gwen's graduation, kind of thing. As if God was a kind of balcony where our loved ones were looking down, keeping tabs on the unfolding of our family stories. Kind of sentimental stuff about the afterlife prevails. And yet, I find it relatively rare for people to say, it's very scary, but I'm looking forward to eternity. It's just not what you hear people say. It's rare. And I think one of the reasons is that it's nothing to do with people rebelling against the doctrine being rammed down our throats by the official church. You know, that I don't buy that kind of crap. People are not rebelling against, you know, a doctrinal authority. What that we're really doing is we're buying into a shallow and secularized understanding of the human person. Where, you know, Stephen Hawking, a very afflicted but very brilliant man, says the brain is a computer, and when it breaks down, it's finished. And this scientific understanding of the brain as a machine that malfunctions and is then going to disintegrate, and that's the end, has sort of invaded conscience to a very considerable degree, so that many people who are very happy to turn up to the Eucharist on a Sunday really do not have a living faith in the prospect of sharing God's eternity or life beyond or through death. Because we're basically saying the brain's a machine and it'll malfunction and then it'll cease and then that's the end of it. If you are in relation with a loved one with dementia, you're in some sense seeing a person die before death, aren't you?
Yes.
So what you believe about eternity, resurrection, life after death, actually matters. Because if you do not have a living personal faith in the potential of the human person to be raised up into God's eternity, you are watching a person die by inches before your very eyes. And then the end of it is total malfunction, breakdown, the lights go out, the line goes flat on the monitor. That's it. One possibility for us is that our capacity to live with a certain serenity, acceptance, and imagination of someone who is suffering from dementia, it might be that our ability to be with them could be immeasurably enhanced if we looked again in depth at what the Christian faith actually teaches about resurrection. And that's why I think it'd be worth reviving two neglected streams of reflection, the language of soul and the language of resurrection of the body. Let me try and do it for you before your very eyes. When Christianity, Orthodox historic Christianity, uses the language of soul, it's really saying that the human person is eligible for such an intimacy with God the Creator that our own lives and persons, as they unfold and evolve, become embedded in the very texture of God's life. That we become inextricably enmeshed in God. And that though our bodies eventually break down, and our brain shuts down, and our bodies are destroyed after death, our lives are held and sustained in the being and the heart of God as the unique, living, and particular persons we have become. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? The Christian doctrine of the soul is not that there's some kind of metaphysical entity that's somehow been a lodger in our bodies, and when the lease is up, we die, it kind of floats away from the body and migrates to a sphere called heaven. That's a mythological understanding. What we're really saying is, put so beautifully in the words of St. Paul, you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Christianity is really teaching that the human person, as it unfolds, is putting roots down into the very being of God. The roots are so profound in the Creator's very being that we can be raised into the very dimension of God's eternity, even though our bodies will eventually die. You died, you've been baptized, that's what Paul says in Colossians, and your life is hidden with Christ in God, that we are embodied and embedded in the person of God. And therefore, all of us have a profoundly hidden life, which even though our brains might deteriorate, just like our bodies can, our persons are in fact living and intact in a hidden way because our lives are already in union with God. So I think, this for me is not an abstract or metaphysical speculation. I think of my godmother. My father flirted with her during the war when he was stationed in Canada. She was quite a young lady. She'd just come back from finishing school in Switzerland. And they had quite a little thing going out in Victoria. But my father wasn't a Christian. He didn't know any Christians. So when I was born, although Valerie lived 6,000 miles away, he asked her to become my godmother. I would not be standing in front of you today had she not written to this little boy in an agnostic, non-church-going household, where we got a secret sort of Christianity thing going on between us. She prayed for me, she wrote me letters, she sent me books, she would visit occasionally when she came to England, I visited occasionally in Canada. And this godmother relationship was very important for me. It had been the thread which sustained me through early years when there was an entirely non-for-the-church environment as a kid. And she was a devout and self-giving person. Traditional church-going, altar guild, 8 o'clock, annual retreat, She was it. She was that old sacramental life Christian. And she spent her whole career as a child social worker for kids at risk. And she'd been a very self-giving life for the last 10 years of her life. Total eclipse. Dementia onset, very rapid. And for her, a positive repulsion against any approach by any religious person. No wanting to sit with the others for a religious service. No wanting the sacraments. No prayer. There's a complete, total eclipse of her religious life. What would you make of it? For me to pray for her and to relate with her is to say her life is hidden with Christ in God. To say that the beauty of her person, the integrity of her identity was perfectly safe in that core place in the hands of God. No matter how on the level of her brain misfiring, she had lost all conscious connection with what we call religion. I was able in some sense to lean into my own belief in the resurrection, to say, not only was she intact as a living person inside this exterior of distress and dysfunction, but that the creed, when it says, I believe in the resurrection of the body, is saying something incredibly consoling, which is to say that the heart of God is the ultimate repository for all our memories. You've all panicked, haven't you, in your computer when it breaks down. You say, "Did I back it up? Did I back it up?" And if you'll pardon a rather modern analogy, The heart of God is the total backup system for our lives. Even if a person can't remember the slightest thing, not even what they had for breakfast 15 minutes ago, the totality of their lives and memories are raised up into the heart of God, where every detail of them, every crumb has been gathered up by God. So that in the amazing prospect that we will be sharing God's eternity, all our life will be waiting for us in absolute completeness. Of course, it'll be a shock to the system, because God says, well, I didn't censor the story quite like you used to. Let's review some of the parts that we're going to need forgiveness about, that you need to integrate, and the forgiveness. Oh boy! Wait till our story meets God's version of the story. But that's what judgment means. Judgment means the purgation we will go through when we see our own story and those of others through the eyes of God instead of our own. Anyway, suffice it to say that for me, when I thought about my godmother Valerie and her utter loss of all her memories, I was able to say, actually, nothing's been lost. She'll get it all back. It's all there. It's all intact. And you see, I think the church was very deliberate and almost perverse when it put into the creed, we believe in the resurrection of the body. Because that's a way of saying God wants all of us. And just as Jesus was raised with his wounds, so in some sense Christianity says that God intends to raise up into eternity, into his heart, the totality of our lives, not something abstract called the soul, and that God wants all the memories, everything that is distinctive and real about the person, to be part of the riches of what the creed called the communion of saints. Communion of saints is, I get to show you show me your memories and I'll show you mine. Which is to say, some kind of sense in which God is going to pool the whole richness of the entire human story by an ingathering. Our lives will all converge on God. Well, you might think, oh my God, he's gone too far, he's left me behind. But I'm just saying, from my own personal point of view, we might find that some of the resources that we need to live with serenity and grace might be found in our own mental attics, where we've stuck certain Christian ideas or doctrines as if we pushed them out of sight up into the attic. We might need to get them down and discover that what was in the box was a Stradivarius, or a treasure. So one of the challenges I'm going to say is that what is a human person? That very remarkable question is going to be answered by very different ways. An agnostic neighbor is going to say, my husband is dying by inches. When his memory has gone, it's gone. I'm just going to see an irrevocable decline. He's no longer the person I knew. He's no longer the man anyone knew. He is an empty shell. He is a husk. He is, you might want to say sometimes at 4 a.m, a vegetable. I mean, people use this language. Let's not be in denial. These diminishing, pathetic, or tragic, shrunken understandings of the person might be what that person is actually saying Someone who believes in the resurrection might say, well, you know, hidden in the core of this suffering companion of mine, who can't remember the damnedest thing, who is totally at sea or askew or disorganized, interior or in his connection with God, he is intact. He is alive, he is real. He is whole in his interface with the love and the heart of God. And instead of me lacerating myself with these harsh and ghastly words about a person, I might even be able to share a kind of a shared joke with God. You just say, you know, he drives me crazy, he's totally nuts, he's totally dependent, and yet, oh God, you've got him as he really is, and you're holding him, and he's real for you, and I can trust you, and I can live with this memory loss because you are holding him in your hands and holding him to your heart. And as Mother Julian said, all manner of things shall be well, that we face a reunion, an eventual reunion in our newfound wholeness. I carry around with me a mental image of a great artwork by an English artist who died in the early 50s called Sir Stanley Spencer. Have you ever heard of him? Yes. Look him up. In his early days, he wrote, he painted for all his entire life a series of paintings in which Christ's life was set in his own Thameside village of Cookham in Berkshire in England. It's one of the most amazing bodies of religious art in the Western world. And at one stage he painted some of the biggest canvases ever produced, which are gigantic canvases of the resurrection, of the resurrection to come, taking place in the village churchyard. In the Tate Gallery, you see the resurrection in Cookham churchyard. And there you see the turf rolled back from the graves like those old-fashioned sardine cans. And all these people climbing up, you know, the sort of village girls and the grandees and people from various generations are clambering out. And there's a boat on the river that represents the transport that's going to take them to the throne of God. And people are sort of looking at each other and saying, well, kind of, who are you and when did you live? And people are blinking in the daylight. And right in the middle is a picture of him, a young man, shirtless, leaning rather nonchalantly on the graves. He started the painting the first morning, the night after he'd had sex for the first time. So you can see this huge creative upsurge of his own artistic vision. But to me, this very concrete, very real, naive painting is a profoundly moving key to present and future relationships with people who at the close of their life seem to be shriveling away to nothing. Because this vista that Christians have of our own resurrection, to me is extraordinarily empowering in my relationship with people who are experiencing such tremendous and poignant loss. Well, you might have questions about this, but this is the first thing that I'm proposing as a challenge to you. I can't produce out of a hat, you know, take these 3 pills and you'll believe in the life to come, you know, by morning. But I want to say to you, be emotionally honest about the real difference it would make if you believed that death was the end for yourself and your loved ones. as opposed to belief that our lives are hidden with Christ in God, and that we are embedded and will be re-embodied in the heart and the life of God. I mean, it makes a huge difference. And if for a long time you hover in a rather sort of semi-agnostic middle position, well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's a time for you to risk something about this. And even in your own prayers to say, God, if it's true that you hold our souls in life, wake me up to the truth of it. Maybe it's time for me to be aroused or enkindled or awakened to this possibility, because it could make a huge difference. My first exposure to people who continue to integrate into the religious community, people with dementia, was my contact with religious communities as a young man, mainly communities of sisters. And I was very struck by the fact that when sisters, who were notoriously long-lived, because they've lived such good lives, when religious sisters became, as it was referred to then, senile, which is a rather shocking word, but we have perhaps dementia sounds better because it's in Latin. Yes. When they lost their morals, when they completely lost even any evidence of the religious faith they'd been living for decades as nuns, even then the sisters were woven into the texture of the life of the community. I almost said irregardless. I like that American word. It's such a wicked, bad word. Irregardless. I remember I used to have to celebrate at the All Saints Convent in Oxford, where there were always the prospect of 6 crazy old nuns who could act out in any unpredictable way, any minute. And the sisters took it all in their stride, and I was expected to. So I remember my first time celebrating there, and I was very young when I was ordained. I moved to the altar, I opened my mouth, and this little nun, a little old shrunken nun in a wheelchair, said, "Oh, what a beautiful boy!" She said, so all the sisters trying to keep their composure. What's going to happen? Or there was a convent I used to visit in Burnham, strictly enclosed contemplative nuns. You didn't even see them because they were in a sort of side chapel that faced onto the side of the altar. And they have got a number of sisters with dementia. But they were laboriously dressed in their habits. They were laboriously brought to every act of worship. And during the psalms, there were pauses during the verses. Occasionally you'd hear this. So, they'd sing a verse of a psalm, then you'd hear, "Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. The psalm is still. The nursery rhyme was allowed to continue. Then the sisters took up the psalm without missing a beat. Or I remember being a celebrant at rather hair-raising Eucharist at the old people's home run by the St. Margaret sisters in Boston, where all the patients, and many of them with severe dementia, or various forms of malfunction, including some sisters, several of whom were notorious for being shocking swearers. So you would go along the communion rail, and then this very feisty nun would start to fight and swing her fists, and then terribly fleeted would come pouring out. And it was a big test. You could see the Mother Superior looking at me. How are you going to? Are you going to start walking on eggshells or getting shaky or something like that? Or are you just going to be able to weave this into the story of this Eucharist? Are you going to just continue with the communion? There was a protocol for giving this sort of wild, crazy, old foul-mouthed non-communion. And I learned from the expression on the faces of the experienced sisters that dedicated their lives to dementia patients. I could see something in their face. They were asking something of me as a very young man, saying, now, can you build this into your understanding of what the Eucharist of Jesus is? Or are you going to think that it's some shocking anomaly, or that the sisters should have been left in their room and smuggled communion to them on the side? Are you going to allow them to have their place in the community, come what may? Are you going to take in your stride the fact that some very unintegrated aspects of the sisters' lives were the only parts of the brain that were still working? She could swear like a trooper who couldn't remember the damnedest thing. Could you build that into the human narrative of what body broken and blood poured out mean? The Eucharist has a tragic dimension. It has a tremendous dimension of loss. It came from the moment where Jesus didn't know what was happening next and was leaning into the unknown and was facing his own death and loss. That's where the Eucharist came from. Can you build in what's happening in this minute? Where we've got to physically restrain this old man. Urgency. Can you lean into that? Can you smile back at it? Can you breathe while you're doing it? Because he wasn't able to breathe. But I learned to breathe. So next time you come, just breathe into it. And I'm just telling these stories because I think it sort of exemplifies that in the community of faith, there was a lived mystical understanding of the person. It wasn't just a humanistic philosophy of tolerance, We've just got to cope with these old biddies that have lost their marbles, sort of thing. Or its more pious versions. It was sister is still sister, and sister's soul is totally intact, and sister's person is absolutely real, and is worthy of reverence, respect, and that she belongs as much at the table of the Lord, if not more, as you do, in the very pathos of her vulnerability, in the exposure of which she's not even aware, she truly belongs. Which is why we go to such great lengths to, dress her up in a habit and bring her here. So I'm just sort of saying that doctrines and beliefs about the human person, the soul, are not abstract concepts that are to be, taken or leaving. They're really sort of pointers or clues to a way of, they're keys to making meaning. So I think that's the first challenge I'm offering them. I've gone on perhaps longer, but the time for a little stretch break now. I'm exemplifying the fact that we might have some tools already in our possession. It's just they're very blunt, they're very unused, they're very relegated to a closet. And the crisis might be bringing them out and reimagine and reconceive. By doing this and by really praying about it, we're praying to God about saying, I've muddled along with my agnosticism about life to come, but it would make a big difference if I were now to believe in this embeddedness in you that the Christian faith really believes. It would make a huge difference. I think for me, if in 15 years, I'm not just dropping things, but I can no longer recall, and I'm forgetting, and I'm remembering, and I'm sort of you know, find myself wandering around the supermarket and forgetting really why I'm here or what. At those very early stages, I might have time to really pray into my own oncoming loss. And at that time to deepen in readiness and to offer God my own into your hands I commend my spirit and my life. So to be able to say to God, you know, I'm losing it, but you're keeping it. You're keeping it for me. You're keeping it with me. I might have a couple of years where that sort of transition is taking place, where I can live into my faith. You know, it's okay. I accidentally put my photo album in the trash last week. All those memories. What was I doing? I don't even know why I did it. I lost it. How could I do it? Then I might say, oh, but you've got them all, Lord. You've got them all and more. I just took 500 snaps that ended up in the album. You have 1 trillion snaps in my life. And will have all the time in the world for me to re-experience my life through your eyes. I mean, I can imagine this. You know. I'm the only one who talks like this, that's in my experience. So anyway, I try to talk to myself. Does this have any ring bells? And does my analysis of the current state of belief in the afterlife in the Episcopal Church seem reasonably true? Let's take a break now, and we'll come back and continue the conversation. 10 minutes exactly, so it's 10:30 now, meet at 9:30. We'll continue in a similar vein.
Oh, I will, right.
That helps me think about myself.
Right,
I'm 75 years old,
right.
pretty good shape, but like retired from parish ministry, and I wound up working in a nursing home and chased people down the hallway to change their diapers, you know, and I see it, and I get horrified.
Yes.
Horrified.
Yes.
My dignity, my ego. I don't want anybody to have that with me.
Right.
And it just occurs to me, we talk about God being inclusive. Everybody. Even natural.
Right, absolutely.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Oh, good to see
Welcome
you.
to Maine. Except and you're approaching it. It's something to enjoy, and I've done it for a year and a half. Now I'm going back to work. I'm a part-time chaplain for a hospice. Are you familiar with iCloud? This gets backed up every night.
Oh, yes.
To iCloud, which is God knows where, somewhere in the cloud.
It's the perfect
It's a perfect.
how you put
Yeah.
things and how you.
I mean, if I could turn this into a lav, or at least just if he had a jacket pocket and we could just clip it on, I think that would work. But he doesn't. So,
It wouldn't work on his belt, that's for sure. Not too much tummy.
This is. um. Anyway, so.
Yeah, I see the problem.
Yeah. So what you. When he turns this way, if he could just be closer, it would be okay as long as he's closer.
I don't all move over to this side of the room. We should probably move over to this side of the room. Well, I may move later. Mary Lee wanted us all to sit together, and I disappoint her. But you are on my mental list for next time.
Yeah.
I'm using wireless because
Yes.
it's
Exactly.
60 feet to the hard wire,
Right.
so
Okay.
otherwise.
Thanks for that.
Okay, great.
Don't be afraid to interrupt if anything needs correcting.
She just called to, during the break.
Good.
If I burst into tears, that would feel right. One becomes more emotional.
Yeah, well. And that's good for the next session. That's good.
Hi. Welcome back to Maine. I heard you've preached it. So.
Oh right, okay, that's right.
And welcome back to Maine. I can ask my question aloud, but you mentioned something earlier. You just mentioned tragic elements in the Eucharist. In your first opening remarks, you said three descriptors: something tragic and profound. And you said a little bit about profound, but I was curious.
Yeah, it'll come out.
Page 26. Nancy and I just said there's a lot. Don't worry, she's been blaming me for something. And I've either forgotten or never said to her. Everybody else thinks like you, except for
No way. When I relate, everybody.
you have us.
Yeah, make sure he's got
Could you be taking your seat now? I'm going to request that no one sit in this far quadrant, because if I turn my head this way, it cuts off the mic for the people offside. Let me switch on. The more people who can be over here, the slightly easier it is to ensure that those who are off-site are not going to get a reduction in the mic volume. If you're all right.
Is this a bad place right now?
No, that's not good. I think the French would claim that the French language is the best for spirituality, and it's true that it really lends itself. But there's a wonderful French word that was used by the great social activist and poet Charles Péguy to describe his own rediscovery of his faith in midlife. And the word is approfondissement, a deepening, an entry into the depths. And I think it's just a great word for the challenge that comes to us at very significant stages of loss and disintegration in our own life journey. Our life is punctuated by times of disintegration, when the way we've made meaning unravels, and we enter into a period of confusion before we can discover the key to the meaning making for the next phase of our journeys. It's very normal to have these periodic breakdowns through the life of the journey, and they are absolutely necessary for us to go on to another phase of meaning making, which is more adequate to the challenges that then emerge. And I think that word approfondissement may be more accessible to us than conversion or some dramatic word like that. It's a way of saying we may have only been living with a shallower or lighter, L-I-T-E, version of something, and only the deeper understanding of it, the deeper, riskier appreciation of it, is going to be sufficient to take us to the next stage of our journey. Don't be surprised if our closing years might be times of, well, it might be pretty climactic for our religious life, because we're being asked to either go deeper or go under, one or the other. We either drown or we dive, to use an image like that. And here's two dimensions we might explore in the next phase of our conversation. We've all been pretty brought up on a pretty smiling, sunny version of Christianity, in which the upbeatness of it all was regarded as essential, Join our lively, vibrant, progressive parish, where joy is the theme of our parish mission. You know what it's like. There's sort of, we market our churches as vibrant, happy, smiling places, and the kids are smiling, and the youth are, growing and, sort of all our children are above average, like in Lake Wobegon, like that. All that stuff is very much part of this ethos. We can't escape being American Christians. A part of the American character has a lot of denial about the tragic dimensions of life. This is why when parish conflict erupts, it's a nasty business, because so much of our aggression has been buried that when it boils over, things turn really nasty. Integration is very hard, and there's a lot in our own sunny side of the street religiosity that is not going to stand us in good stead for the long years of affliction and toil and tragedy that's involved in keeping company with someone in steadily diminishing brain function and life function. Sunny side of the street religiosity simply won't work. And if that's what we've been reliant on, and if we're a bit addicted to it or hooked on it, this could be truly scary. Because we might say, I can't go in, I'm not going in the fundamentalist direction. That's even worse when it comes to forms of denial sometimes. Where can I find another depth dimension to my faith, which is going to be able to integrate this tragic dimension of life, that's going to integrate diminishment and irrevocable loss, that doesn't say each day in every way things are getting better and better, but says actually it's the worst. Each day in every way things are getting worse and worse with Joe or Evelyn or Deborah. And that's the way it is. And it could last for years, and it could tear our hearts apart. What kind of living faith and what kind of prayer life would enable us to be in for the long haul, in affliction and suffering? Two words that you very rarely hear from our sunny side of the street pulpit. There's an early Christian poem which one of the refrains was, learn how to suffer. And we'd have to go back a long way to pick up spiritual books that might say, here's coaching for living with suffering. It's just not part of souffrance. If we spoke French, we'd almost be able to use the language a bit better. But to integrate into our life the daily suffering, loss, or the affliction of living with someone increasingly helpless or hopelessly unpredictable or all over the place. We'll look in the next few hours at some of the themes or resources from the spiritual tradition that might be of help. We'll start off with two. Let me say something which I found helpful about understanding human beings. Every single human baby has been left in the dark, hungry, wet and dirty, long enough for the brain to form deep circuits whose message is, you have been abandoned. Every single human baby has spent long enough being washed and at the breast and held like this by mother, held up like that by father, whatever, long enough for there to be another dimension of our minds and hearts to be formed, which says, you can make it, you are cared for, you are nurtured. And this explains the slight puzzle that some people who had lousy parents, but pretty negligent parents, still turn out to be quite buoyant and resilient and creative people. And some people who had very fond and devoted parenting turn out to be negative, mistrustful, hesitant, skeptical, and uncreative. Because there is no correlation, strictly speaking, between badly being a lousy upbringing and turning out positive. Because every human being has had enough of both for those parts to be creative. No one is safe from a crisis precipitating a retreat into the cave of abandonment. Even though you've had a great job and you've got plenty of money and you're insured to the hilt and everything's antiseptic and well decorated. I mean, your life may be totally together. But if your loved one starts to fall apart in his or her memory, and you face 15 and 20 years of incessant caregiving of someone who doesn't know who you are, you could lose your faith entirely. Because the potential is within you of saying, this means I've been abandoned by God. The God I've been believing in so far was the guarantor of everything going fine. But when everything is not only not going fine, but it's going tragically in the direction of prolonged suffering, this must mean I've been abandoned by God, or there is no God. And I think this, for us to have the emotional honesty to face that it's precisely the crisis in our lives caused by the dementia of a loved one that could be the tipping point for us to lose our faith, to find that someone has pulled the plug on it some night and we wake up and it's drained completely away. We find ourselves in that place that says, I've been left alone with this to carry. So part of our preparation for facing into this possible crisis is to say, what kind of God do I believe in who doesn't abandon but keeps company in the worst that can befall human beings, couples, friends? Do I actually now already relate to God as the one who suffers with us? Now I'm totally puzzled. It's absolutely the bedrock of my faith, and always has been, that God suffers. And the spiritual teachers I've most learned from and respected, this is absolutely central to their understanding of God. I remember one of my teachers who was a tutor of mine at university, who in his wonderful book, The Foolishness of God, has this wonderful line: the hands that hold us in existence are pierced with inimaginable nails. This understanding that the crucified Jesus is the only accurate picture that we've ever received of God has been part of the essential core of my faith from youth. It's been totally second nature for me to say since my teens, in simple, straightforward, unvarnished, God suffers. And God suffers the suffering of all the suffering. God keeps us company in the worst that can befall us. That God is not an observer God. God is not a God looking down on us God, to use that very common language. But God is the one who is, you're going to steadily lose all foothold within yourself. That's a phrase that Teilhard de Chardin uses. In these great spiritualities of the church, there was this enormous resource of experience of people who prayed into and found meaning in the losses of life, losses that were progressive and tragic. How many people have ever studied or struggled with that very difficult book by Théa de Chardin, Le Milieu Divin, the Divine Milieu? You know, it was a book, I remember, I was 14 years old, I think, when it was published, and I marched into the religious bookstore and said, I want a copy of Théa de Chardin's Le Milieu Divin. And the woman in the SBCK bookshop patted me on the head and said, I think it'll be a bit above you at the moment, son. I rose to my full height, and I banged my 2 6 on the table as I wanted the book. And I've read it every year since. In the second part of the book, he has this section which he calls the divinization of our passivities. Not an easy book. What it really means to say is, in that aspect of our life where diminishment is experienced, can we also experience the companionship of God in making meaning of that? Just as we experience God's companionship in our flourishing, in our creativity, in our inventiveness, in our playfulness, and all the positive side. And he has these marvelous prayers about, each chapter ends with a great prayer. There's a wonderful prayer about the prospect of losing all foothold within ourselves, which is his wonderful way of saying what death is like. Finally, to lose the last foothold and have to let go. To just have to let go into God. And it's really a prayer about how we can practice that letting go in advance, as it were, recognizing that just coping with a loved one's loss of, toilet function, and all this cleaning up from bowel movements, and all this sort of dealing with the humiliation and the struggle of perhaps of being a caregiver or seeing oneself go into pieces. One can, in some sense, prepare for that with forms that acknowledge that God keeps us company with and can shape us through loss as well as a gain or growth. It wouldn't be a bad idea for some people to say, well, forget the latest book, coming out on spirituality. Time to blow the dust off Théa de Chardin and discover that some of these great writings are really going to be more help to us than the latest thing coming down the pike from church publishing. Really. I visit Théa de Chardin's grave every year. I have a friend of mine, and we meet up for dinner at the Culinary Institute. Did you know that Théa de Chardin is buried in the graveyard in the grounds of the Culinary Institute of New York in Poughkeepsie? And my friend Ninon and I, when we had a darn good meal in the restaurant, she's like the sister I never had. We have a nice friendship. We get the key from the janitor and we let ourselves into the graveyard, because it used to be the Jesuit house there. And we go and put a rose on his grave, and usually somebody's got to us or something, faded flower there or something there. And it's just my tribute to saying, right since I was a boy, here's a kind of a person of towering integrity and imagination who helped to integrate the whole phenomenon of evolution into the Christian vision. And he was a person who knew how to suffer, was much persecuted by his own church and order towards the end, and died in a very kind of diminished way, having been put down as being too radical. Anyway, I commend it to you and say that these are, I'm not palming off these ideas on you as something that is the latest thing in spirituality. It's rather the oldest thing. Secondly, we might be faced with the fact that our prayer lives are inadequate to the task of living with this degree of loss and suffering that will come to us if we keep company with those who have many years of dementia, where we're connected with them. The way we've prayed up till now is inadequate to the task of continuing for the long haul. And one of the keynotes of a prayer life that's in for the long haul is one that's broken new ground of emotional honesty with God. Prayer is ultimately no different from the extraordinarily taxing work of intimacy that human beings have, which is we can keep on being emotionally honest with each other, or we can fake it and withdraw from real communication. And oh my God, we've all seen those freeze-dried marriages where people have given up long ago the taxing work of being emotionally honest with each other. You see in the coffee shops these couples, stirring their coffee and looking over each other's shoulders, and you can feel in the air the barrenness and non-communication of people who can no longer, or perhaps have not done for years, risk telling each other what they're really feeling and experiencing. Intimacy is an extraordinarily difficult business. My nerves are in shreds at the moment because my partner's been unemployed for a year now. And it's all so scary and so risky as we sort of slide towards genteel poverty, and face it's just very hard to be an unemployed middle-aged black man in America. You're not exactly on the top of everybody's employment list. And it's huge, it's very difficult emotionally to handle it, to cope with it. So here we are. We have difficult things to say to each other. And this is paralleled with our life with God. We have hard things to say to God if we are to be emotionally honest about things we're disappointed about, things we're honest about, things we miss, things we've got to let go of, things we can't handle. And yet, just as in ordinary relationships, there are so many barriers to emotional honesty. Can I risk it? What are the consequences of being honest? Where will it take us? Is it safer to say nothing? Shall I swallow the feelings down? Shall I stuff them down? Shall I skirt them? Shall I censor them? Shall I struggle on my own? Shall I drop hints? Shall I do the passive-aggressive thing, Well, of course, if you were really tuned in, you'd know what I was feeling. And, of course, I don't tell you I love you because you should know that already and all that stuff. There are 1,000 games of emotional avoidance and the skirting of the challenges of intimacy. And quite frankly, we do it with God all the time, using the major excuse of, since God knows everything, I don't have to tell him anything, thus letting us off the hook, which it does nothing of the kind. It only just leaves us more and more with unappropriated intimacy with God. It might be that in our later years might come the crisis in which we get real with God for the first time. And that finding we can get real with God for the first time, discover to our surprise that we have a presence in our lives that's with us for the long haul. And when other sources of intimacy dry up in our lives, we have a taproot of intimacy on which we can rely. I think the loss of intimacy with a loved one with dementia the fact the relationship becomes so much kind of one way that you're no longer receiving or getting much from the other, who most of the time doesn't even know who you are, or why you're bothering, or turning up at the nursing home, or doesn't know you in the morning from the work you did last night. This profound loss of that input of intimacy from someone you used to have only makes the issue of whether you have an interior source of tenderness and affirmation all the more important. And if you had a sort of light prayer life where that wasn't really the issue before, maybe now it is the issue. Maybe now's the time. And emotional honesty would then be about feeling oneself into a conversation with God that is much less censored than anything you'd experienced before, and might consist of more lamenting loss than you've ever even imagined having to do before. I got a bit of a shock going into the children's room and finding this icon. I bought a larger version of this when I was a builder's labourer for the Taizé community in the mid-60s. I bought the version of this beautiful icon. But about 12 years ago, I remember going into the shed and taking a cleaver and chopping the icon into 1,000 pieces in the yard. I gained access to a degree of disappointment and anger with God that was so tumultuous that I could only express it by taking an axe to the icon that I'd carried in every room I'd had for the last 30 years. It's a bit of a shock to have it smiling back at me, saying, I know. But at least necessary for me to start using a language in my own prayer with God, which I'd never used before, to say to God, I'm so disappointed in you. Or I'm so disappointed in life, or I can't get round the resentment I'm feeling about. And I'm just mentioning that because, you can write books on prayer till your cash register's ringing away with people buying copies of books and so on. But it doesn't mean to say that you've necessarily completed your inner work of emotional honesty. You might sometimes write about spirituality as a substitute for living it. But the time comes when it catches up with you, and your pious sermons about being angry with God rather fade away while you march towards the woodshed to get the hatchet out. You might want to say, as if I'm going to lay the groundwork for a life that has quite a lot of loss in it ahead, I need to find a kind of prayer in which I can express straightforwardly what I'm feeling, and that God, as it were, stays with me and holds me as I express emotions from across the range which I need to be able to say, well, this is actually how it is with me. So I'm just putting this out. There's no easy way of telling people how to do it. Sometimes I think for a lot of us, we have to do it in a rather kind of hit and run way. Which is to say, I can't settle down for half an hour of prayer and being angry with God. But we might just blurt stuff out about how we're actually being. And getting into the way of life in which our prayer is a place that is hospitable to our confused and tumultuous feelings. That prayer is a place of hospitality towards feelings that would fill us with shame and seem terribly risky to share with other human beings, except the most understanding and devoted friend or skilled therapist. So I just put it out, and it will be, prayer is a very clumsy and discordant business. I'm not terribly sold on a lot of propaganda for prayer about an avenue towards serenity and wholeness. I mean, a lot of people trying to palm off contemplative prayer as just really a form of soothing and calming, serenity. Whereas, actually, life is not life is a kind of discordant and troubling challenge, and we might, in some sense, be invited by God into a place where our own expressions of feeling seem very jarring and hard. And yet, with practice, practicing the scales of lamenting and rejoicing, we might get into the way of discovering that we have a companion for our lives who is completely unfazed by whatever we're coming through, because God is coming through with us already. There's nothing foreign to God about any of our emotions, no matter how discordant or apparently sacrilegious. And it'd be very, very strange if people like us could make the transition into a spirituality for the long haul, who hadn't gone through some difficult times with God, about coughing up or spitting up our feelings of rage, resentment, and disappointment. That this is the hand that has been dealt. I've loved praying with, that St. Patrick's breastplate prayer that goes through all the different ways in which God accompanies. Christ above me, Christ beside me, Christ beneath me, Christ behind me. Wonderful form of prayer, because the presence of God feels different in each way you conceive of that presence. Above is very different from below. But when I prayed with Christ behind me, it reminded me of the way my stepmother would hold my forehead and kneel behind me when I was being sick as a child into the toilet. I'd eaten a whole bag of licorice or something crazy, or else I'd had a stomach upset. But instead of shoving me into the bathroom and telling me to puke up on my own, she was quite prepared to support me with a cool hand on the brow. Just help me be sick and then help with the wiping up. Now that's, to me, it's a model for prayer that Christ behind us can say, your disappointment about what's happened to your husband or but it's so poisoning to you. Just cough it up, bring it up, puke it up. It'd not do you any good being stuffed down there. Just bring it out, and I will support you and help you as you. Now, vomiting as a model for prayer is not something we hear of every day. I think it's very real to that kind of emotional state, that God is that cooling hand, that supportive presence that enables us to articulate and to face emotions which otherwise would sort of poisonous if they're left inside. They need to be brought up and out. So one of the paths then is the question to live with is, how much practice can I start putting in of riskier levels of emotional intimacy with God? checking in with God, coughing up to God, getting it out with God, saying how it is with you, and using words that freak out your inner censor. Oh, you can't say that to God. Well, I'm going to. I remember working with a spiritual director in very painful circumstances, where I just really had to sort of say, you know, I'm still disappointed with God, and this word has never, ever crossed my lips before. So, but I had to stay with it. There was some level of disappointment. By now something should have happened, by now this, by now the other, and I just have to live with it. So in relation to find a more vernacular and robust prayer that could be a model for those months and years when you're living with the exasperation and bafflement of coping with someone with dementia. What kind of language would you use? This sucked today. This is one of the days I feel abandoned. Dear God. And then fill in the blank with a word that would be very strong language for you. Or other days which are, it's amazing how one can get along with this when one gets into the swing of it. Sharing with God little degrees of progress in which you've sort of gotten the hang of dealing with this level of exasperation or whatever. Which slightly brings me, if you've got the patience, do you want a little stretch break of 10 minutes or 5 minutes? Or are we all good for another half an hour? What do you think? You all right? I think it leads to another word that comes out of the great spiritual tradition, which is a word we don't really get much mileage out of. That word is detachment. One of the when we ask the question, what are the characteristics of a person who has integrated this new phenomenon into their lives and has moved on to another level of being able to stay flourishing and together in it? We said, have you met people who've been caring for partners with Alzheimer's, who've made a sort of breakthrough to some dispassion with it, in some sense? A dispassion that says, Herbert's life is very diminished, but I have a life, and I'm responsible for being creative towards the life that I have. My life has not been destroyed or sucked into the failing and the diminishment of my partner. God is on my side in me making a new sense of self in this circumstance of diminishment, and that God is on my side, giving me something that the tradition calls a detachment, which is a sense of, I love him dearly, I'm committed to him to the end, but he is not destroying my life through his Alzheimer's. I'm still me. I have my own life, my own desires, my own interests, and that God is mysteriously on the side as I do a certain inner work of respecting the integrity of my own person. Am I getting at something? I was mesmerized by a program that was on in England. I was with my stepmother, who was 93, sharp as a tack, as it happens. And we were watching a program put on about someone who had been spending a long time in care facilities for Alzheimer's patients and really exploring what was happening in the staff and on the spouses of those who were resident and what was happening. And it was really a fascinating real-life look at some of the dynamics. And the camera followed around a woman who was devoted to her husband, who's relatively young. I think he was still in his early 60s. And her husband did not recognize her at all. He thought they'd had some kind of business affiliation throughout their life. So he assumed when she visited him that she was a kind of kind business associate. He couldn't quite figure out why she cared enough to keep on calling in to this degree. I found that all very peculiar because they'd only just worked together. So that was the picture. So they'd been married for years, and she was coming, 4 times a week, spending time, and each time treated under this heading. Meanwhile, as part of his dementia, his erotic life was up and running. And he had quite some flirtations going, including a pretty hot and strong relationship with another relatively young resident woman. And they had quite a thing going. And, this is one example of the kind of human comedy of this tragedy. It's like, who knows what parts of the brain will still be up and running when others, especially memory, have gone down. And so she comes in day by day as the sort of tolerated ex-office worker, while he flirts away and sort of recounts his goings-on with Mary, in the next corridor. But there was something on her face which was something of kind of acceptance or dispassion. You could see that she was not destroyed by this. She was not sort of ravaged. She was not indifferent to it, but she'd reached some place of equanimity, just simply recognizing that this was the way it was, and that she was able to kind of lean into it. And there was, how faces are so revealing, aren't they? Just something on her face that said that she'd made this breakthrough to something that I think is telling us what the saints used to mean by this word detachment. It is somehow the recognition that someone else's strangeness need not destroy us or kind of suck all the life out of us or cancel out our life and our integrity. This phenomenon did not cancel their marriage out, did not send her into a tailspin about morality or something. She just reached some place of dispassion. And I think this is one of the other themes that we might begin to reflect on, which is a very deep topic, which is the challenge of being widowed is colossal, isn't it? Well, most of you know that better than I could ever imagine. But it's when your life has been lived in relation with someone else, and when everything is dual and partnered, and the kind of investment in this partnership, and then overnight, in the cases of sudden death, it's cut off, and you have to go through an agonizing process, the outcome of which you hope will be a reforming of the self as a single person again, still connected and still reverent towards the relationship one had, but willing to go into this new phase where you have, in some sense, to do for yourself what the partner used to do, where you used to have to reconfigure one's own emotional boundaries and needs and stuff like that. Well, I need to say no more. Everyone knows what I'm talking about. But I suppose the peculiarity of living with someone with dementia is that this process happens before death has actually happened. And it doesn't happen
in a clean break. It doesn't say, okay, my husband had cancer for 3 years and then finally remission, he didn't get remission and that was it. Or I came back from the office one day and discovered my husband had dropped dead in the garage. I mean, it's like, it could be spread out over years, where a partnership in which one's life was wholly bound up with the other person diminishes by tiny cuts over weeks and months and years, that this return to singleness has to be enacted while the other partner is still actually alive and you're actually related to them, but they can no longer provide any emotional sustenance or return to you and is either dependent or remote from you on an emotional and personal level. Well, I know I'm only just thinking about these things, even as we speak, and just leaning into them. But I'm thinking, good heavens, how could you do that on your own? That very task itself would be one that requires such support and sensitivity for you to say, somehow I've got to start taking responsibility for being single again in a way, or being my own self while my spouse is still actually alive. This, to me, would be a spiritual task of extraordinary challenge to it. I don't think I could do it alone. I think I would need to be in conversation with people who had nothing at stake except my own well-being, therapists, confidants, spiritual directors, who could start to sort of encourage and nudge me towards regathering my own life and re-reverencing my own needs as a single person, so that I don't become an empty shell or cipher whose life only means the number of visits I make to my spouse in the care center, or I am nobody except the one who copes with Sally or Joe. But the process of being, I'm actually me. I have my own life. I have my own needs. I have my own hopes, my own challenges. And I am the one married to, caring for, and with a spouse. But I'm also this self whose life goes on and whose needs are to be imagined, reverenced, supported. Now, I think you know more about this than I do, so I'm going to stop talking there and just say, in this case, a prayer which was based on emotional honesty would be sensing that God was really on your side as you felt your way into a way of life that honored your own personhood as you lived through this emotional separation from your loved one. I can imagine God praying along lines like, God, I am so ambivalent about spending time for myself. I feel that any time I spend for myself is stolen from my partner. I feel any thoughts about my own needs a form of cheating on his priorities, care or something. I'm sure it will be a very risky and precarious thing to do, to begin to say, what do I need for myself? How will I be replenished? What will Sabbath mean for me? What will be enough rest for me? What kind of break do I need from this? The challenges of total care for or about someone else are very great because they risk being total in their claims in a way that threatens to eviscerate or take away any claims to have a life of one's own, or a person of one's own. A prayer life guided by a pretty solid spiritual director would enable me to start, as they say, not getting a life, but shaping it or forging it in small increments that say, if I'm in for the long haul, this is who I need to be for myself as I lean into a kind of singleness I never expected to experience while my spouse was still alive. Does that make sense? Well, it's 1:45, and it might mean that just before lunch there might be some questions about this morning's time together, which could be asked now. I'm going to repeat your question so that everyone can hear it.
This goes back to something you said much earlier.
This goes back to something I said much earlier.
The difference between the mythology of soul.
Yes, the difference between the mythology of soul going somewhere.
Going back, being enmeshed and entwined.
Yes, being enmeshed and entwined with the heart of God.
Not enmeshed as it
Yes,
is.
yes. Do you want me to just unpack that a bit more? I don't think the language of soul has been usable for a long time in its conventional form, because it seemed to demand a metaphysical belief in a kind of eternal entity that somehow got lodged in the physical envelope of the body. And this conventional doctrine excites in a lot of people a skepticism which is quite well founded. As to say, why should we be required to believe that there's some kind of floating entity to the soul that is then migrates to a sphere called heaven? In other words, but it was a particular mythology that human beings used and have used in different contexts to face into the mystery of human personhood and the human intuition that something more survives after a person dies. It's just that Christianity doesn't attach itself to that speculative metaphysical belief. Instead, its main symbolism is drawn from the hope expressed in Scripture of the resurrection of the body, in which is a specifically Jewish vision of the future, in which God does not retrieve a certain element of ourselves, discarding all that the body means, but rather God affirms and desires the whole human person in relationship with others. So the word resurrection of the body is really God saying, I want all of you, not part of you. So Christianity is a very obstinate, almost counterintuitive faith that says, although on one level you might think that some sort of sublime part of ourselves is saved, God says, I want the real whole you. So that the belief in the resurrection that Jesus espoused himself was a belief that ultimately God was going to recreate us in a new embodiment, which meant that in Christian iconography and Christian art, there is this visionary projection of a fullness being restored to human beings, including all that was implied by the resurrection of our bodies, so that our sexuality, our physical creativity is all what God wants to eternalize, not some sublime, ethereal dimension of ourselves.
That's, okay, so that's assuming that the soul is seen as an ethereal
Yes.
dimension.
That's assuming the soul is seen as an ethereal dimension. And in the Mediterranean world to which Christianity emerged, in Hellenistic religiosity, the Greeks and the Romans, the body was regarded as a vile tomb of clay, which would be quite rightly discarded and spurned at death so that the pure soul could float free. And Christianity comes along with saying, no, we say to God, why not take all of me? In a sense, it's this sense that somehow, and I mean, the Christian doctrine is that God sort of did something to show that this was the right way to go by actually raising Jesus from the dead. The empty tomb says, yes, I really mean it. And Paul says, one down, the rest of us to go. Where the resurrection of Jesus was seen as God showing his hand in history, that God really meant it, that this wasn't just a speculative dream, but God actually meant business. It's the whole person, wounds and all, is raised up. To me, however unfashionable this is, as I find continually thrilling and exciting. I think it is something that makes Christianity very distinctive and throws a flood of light on the business of living, which is God rejoices in our physicality, in our sexuality, in the erotic life, in everything that the bodies do, and everything expressive. So that if I go to the opera or the ballet or a concert, or if I visit a craftsperson in a pottery or something like that, everything that is intensely physical and creative, or in sex, to me this is spiritual. It's like all this is the best clue to what God revels in, what God delights in. So I think a true Christian vision does something very, very hard, which is at the one time affirms the precariousness of our bodies, their vulnerability, their fragility, the risk to us of being embodied. And at the same time, the goodness and the beauty and the marvelousness of embodiment. And it holds the two intimately together in the image of a Savior, a glorified Savior with pierced hands. It's very dynamic, very paradoxical, very subtle in the way Christianity, properly understood, lives into both these things. So it can say, we can look and say, the brain is the most amazing thing in creation. Even the scientists tell us that its complexity and the vastness of its neuronal circuits exceeds anything in the universe that we can detect or imagine, that is exquisitely and magnificently complex, so that scientists admit we only know a tiny fraction of how the brain works, what it does, and at the same time how vulnerable it is. And Alzheimer's telling us that this magnificent creation that the human brain, in its unimaginable capacities and creativity, is very vulnerable. And that Alzheimer's for us represents our mass vulnerability. You know, I have a dear friend who's having a second bout with a brain tumor, so we know about vulnerability with that. But here's a form of vulnerability which is sort of built in now to a lot of what we must experience. So anyway, we could talk indefinitely about these things, but I'm fascinated and excited by Christianity's remarkable holding together both of physical vulnerability and precariousness and this intrinsic reverence for the body and for physicality and for sacramentality of the body. It's an amazing and rich thing. We don't do justice to it, do we, in our everyday faith and liturgies. Precariousness, you know, it's a wonderful word to use in spirituality. When we say it comes from the Latin word precari, to pray. Something is precarious if it can only be negotiated by praying about it and praying through it. A precarious situation. And in some sense, the precariousness of the aging process. How precarious memory is, how precarious our everyday functions are, how vulnerable to loss and diminishment. Well then, the only response must be to pray into it, to pray through it, to express the fact that God accompanies us on this journey. Very good. I think we're near enough to lunch. And I'm going to suggest that during the lunch break, as we move into a mode of more questions, think of 2 questions in the coming hour. Question 1 is, what was the question you brought with you to today that you would like to explore more? And then secondly, which is the question I really don't know whether I have the courage to ask out loud? And that's not a value judgment. It's not saying you should do anything with that question. But just put your finger on something which, if you asked it, it would have taken quite some courage on your part to say it out loud. And then these might be resources for our exploration. And then this afternoon, as we move into a question and answer mode, again, I'm not bringing out answers to questions. I'm just partnering with you in practicing asking the questions that we will need to continue to explore and live into. I don't have a bag of answers for everything about this, but Elie Wiesel, he said, there are questions that are more important than any answer that could be given to them. And it's probably on that kind of level that we can help one another. Oh, and my books are for sale during the lunch break, and no home is complete without them.
And another one coming out.
Yes.
Yes, yes. Before we break, I would like just to introduce our committees on the spirituality of aging in the Diocese of Maine, and also the Dementia Project. Marianne, I don't have the name quite right. But why don't Mary Ann Hoy stand up, who is the project for the Dementia Ministry in Maine, and Marty Payson and Jay and Rachel Zoller. You stand up too. And, of course, in the spirit, but and Nancy Matulis is up in Gilbert Foxcroft. She couldn't make it down today, but she's very much a part of it. We're always looking for members. So also, if you have topics that you would like us to wrestle with and bring to everybody, please let us know. So thank you, and I offer blessing for lunch. Yes.
Lunch is bag lunch. There's veggie, ham, and I'm not sure what it is. I think I'm sure. And fruit and water. And you're welcome to take it outside and take a chair out with you if you like to sit outside.
We've got a few chairs set up already.
There are a few out there. We also have 2 tables set up in the room so that people that aren't able to go outside or don't wish to can get a table. And please,
Thank you. Holy One, we offer our sweet gratitude for the food that nourishes us and for the conversations. May they be candid, may they be deep, may they be questioning, and may we listen to each other with trust, with openness, and with our thanks. Amen.
Amen.